I'm going to show you how to go from this to this. Today on 4-Minute Film School, we're creating cinematic lighting on an iPhone. Let's go. So what's the difference between the camera on your phone and a typical cinema camera? Phone cameras are getting better and better, with higher resolutions and frame rates becoming more and more common, but can you really get a cinematic image with just your phone? One major difference with cell phones is depth of field. Sensor size is sometimes related to resolution, but one thing sensor size has a big effect on is depth of field. So with phones, it's much harder to achieve that cinematic shallow depth of field. Cell phones also have a very wide lens. Wide lenses make it harder for you to achieve that cinematic composition and shallow depth of field. Another big difference is dynamic range. This refers to the amount of information a camera can record between the shadows and its highlights. Cinema cameras have a very high dynamic range. Phone cameras, on the other hand, typically have a very limited dynamic range. There are still ways of achieving cinematic images. We're going to show you how to shape your light to get the most out of your phone's camera. So for today's episode, we're skipping the red camera and going straight with an iPhone, specifically the iPhone XR. And we also have a few important things attached to it. We have the Filmic Pro App installed. One important thing to know is most phones have their video set to auto. You can't really adjust the shutter speed or the aperture or the ISO. However, the nice thing about Filmic Pro is you can adjust all that stuff. And this gives you manual control over your phone's camera. Another thing to note is we have a moment lens attached to our phone, specifically an anamorphic lens, which gives us that nice widescreen look. So for our first setup, we have two 120D Mark IIs with double CTO, which basically just means two layers of color temperature orange, creating a nice warm hue on our backdrop. Light is bouncing off of the wall here, hitting the diffusion. It's just providing a nice even layer of light onto the background, creating a nice silhouette of our subject. So for our second light, we have the Aperture MC acting as a practical within our scene. And this light is set to 5600 Kelvin to act as nice color contrast against our warm background. So for our last light, we have the Aperture 120D Mark II, and this light still isn't hitting our subject. In fact, it's hitting the camera, which creates some nice anamorphic lens flares. This daylight colored light gives some nice color contrast to the overall image. Phones don't really have a wide dynamic range, so what we do first is set your exposure on your phone. You can then modify the lights and the brightness of these lights to fit within that small dynamic range. We made sure each of our lights fit within that small range, but still differed enough to add some contrast to the image. Let's take a look at that shot put together. Now on to our second shot in our scene, we still have the 120D Mark IIs creating our book light, now casting light onto our subject because of the different camera position. For our second light, we have the 300X set to 2700 Kelvin to emulate the same warmth coming from the window. One thing we noticed was the opposite side of the face was a little too dark, so we added this light, which was set to 15%, and that was just enough light to fill in those shadows. Moving on to our third light, we have the Mini 20. This light, the book light, and 300X create an interesting key light, combining both the specular highlight and slow fall off. Similar to the MC, our 120D Mark II is doing the same exact thing. It's flaring the camera, providing a nice anamorphic lens flare. And now let's take a look at all that put together. Time for a recap. In order to achieve cinematic images on your phone, there are three things to remember. 1. Use manual control. Using a filmmaking app that unlocks abilities on your phone will really help you get the most out of your camera. 2. Light for dynamic range. Understand the limitations of your phone and fine-tune your lights in order to get the most range out of your lighting setup. And 3. Create your own depth. Using things like lens adapters, color contrast, and background lights can create depth without needing the shallow depth of field.